Hey, guys. Tonight we're settling into something gentle, a little strange, and honestly, kind of inevitable in European history. So if you're lying down, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe adjust your pillow like the royalty we're about to meet never could, because their spines were basically question marks from generations of creative cousin selection. We're beginning our slow drift into the world of royal inbreeding, where dynasties treated the family tree less like a branching structure and more like a circle. And yes, of course they did. When your entire political strategy depends on marrying the same handful of noble families, things get weird fast. And tonight, we're just going to gently wade into that weirdness together, without judgment. Well, maybe with a tiny bit of judgment. Sleepy judgment. Let's float over now to one of history's most iconic genetic experiments, the Habsburgs, the undisputed champions of marrying people with the same last name. Charles II of Spain, the final Habsburg glitch. Let's talk about Charles II. He's our first stop, mostly because he's the historical equivalent of what happens when you save a video too many times and the file starts losing pixels. Charles was born in 1661, and he entered the world with the kind of energy that says, several of my grandparents are the same person. And that's because they were. The Habsburg dynasty spent centuries treating Europe like a medieval dating app where the only matches that popped up were your cousin, and instead of questioning it, they swiped right every single time. Because why bring new genes into the royal line when you could just remix the old ones like a questionable family playlist? Charles II's family tree is so tangled that historians once calculated his pedigree collapse, and I promise, that's a real term, at over 80%. That means his ancestors weren't branching out. They were looping back like a genetic roller coaster that really needed maintenance. And it showed. Charles was described by ambassadors as, politely, not looking well. More specifically, one said he resembled a half-baked dough. Another said he looked like a man made of wax. And one who was maybe having a bad day said Charles seemed bewitched, which, is medieval diplomat slang for, this man needs help. Of course, the famous Habsburg jaw was front and center, a jaw so long and so proud that when Charles tried to chew, sometimes the food just didn't cooperate. His doctors noted he could barely close his mouth, and speaking was a group project between his tongue and gravity. But despite how dark that sounds, we're going to keep this gentle. Because honestly, Charles wasn't the problem. The problem was being born into a dynasty that was basically a genetic slow cooker. Charles had trouble walking, talking, digesting, seeing, thinking, and overall existing. His tutors reported that he tried very hard, which is sweet, but the bar for royal education was pretty high, and he was trying to climb it with the genetic equivalent of pool noodles. He was crowned king as a child, and the country more or less looked at him and collectively said, "We're doomed." But everyone tried to pretend he was fine, because that's what courts do. If the king is struggling to form sentences, everyone just nods politely and says, "Brilliant idea, Your Majesty." Charles was gentle, kind, and sweeter than the rest of the Habsburgs, which makes his life a little sadder. He wanted to be a good king, but was basically given the body and brain of a medieval Windows XP computer. Constant freezing, very slow processing, needs frequent restarts. His marriages, yes, plural, because why not double down, never produced children, which at that point was probably a sign from the universe saying, I'm ending this dynasty myself. When Charles died in 1700, he was only 38, but biologically felt more like he had lived several centuries. His death triggered the War of Spanish Succession, but tonight we're not going into battles or politics, just floating gently through royal dysfunction. Before we drift away from Charles, the main takeaway is simple. He was the final product of centuries of careful, intentional, extremely enthusiastic cousin marriages, and his body spent his entire life filing genetic error reports. Let's float softly to our next royal, someone whose family also treated marriage like a board game with very few pieces. Joanna of Castile, the Mad, but mostly the product of a bad family. Next up is Joanna of Castile, often referred to as Joanna the Mad, which is a little rude, honestly. Medieval historians loved calling women crazy. It's like their favorite hobby besides wearing itchy clothes. Joanna was born into the Spanish branch of the Trastamara dynasty, which had its own little habits, like marrying close relatives until the gene pool was more like a gene puddle. Her parents were Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, the Catholic monarchs, who themselves came from a long line of respectfully questionable marriages. Joanna had a lot stacked against her from the moment she arrived. Her family was dramatic, her husband was dramatic, her body was dramatic, and her brain was basically living under a constant medieval stress alert. When she married Philip the Handsome, who was technically handsome, but also technically a Habsburg. So interpret that as you wish. Everything went downhill. Philip liked flirting with every woman in Europe. Joanna, meanwhile, was genetically predisposed to anxiety, depression, and emotional instability. So imagine being married to a man who treats being faithful like an optional minigame. The result? Joanna's mental health spiraled, but instead of receiving care, she got the 1500s version of, let's lock her in a tower and call it a day. Her madness was probably a mix of depression, trauma, postpartum issues, and good old-fashioned genetic instability. But history loves a good nickname, so now she's the Mad, even though most of her symptoms can be traced to environmental and hereditary factors, and the fact that she was married to a walking red flag. At one point, she became so overwhelmed after Philip's death that she refused to bury him for a while, traveling with his coffin like a tragic medieval road trip. But honestly, if that's madness, then half the European royals should have been institutionalized centuries earlier. Her behavior makes more sense when you remember she was isolated, manipulated, grieving, sleep-deprived, and genetically wired for emotional strain. Joanna spent the last 46 years of her life locked away, not because she was dangerous, but because she was inconvenient. Her son Charles V, yes, the future emperor, used her mental state as a political tool so he could rule uncontested. Another casualty of dynastic inbreeding and royal neglect. Let's gently drift away from Joanna now, leaving behind her dim castle room and stepping back into the wider world of royal genetics, where things somehow get even stranger. King Philip II, the overachiever of questionable marriages. Let's glide softly into the life of King Philip II of Spain, Joanna's son, and yes, another Habsburg. The Habsburgs were the gift that kept on giving. And by giving, I mean giving their children additional structural challenges. Philip II didn't just marry for politics. He married like it was a competitive sport. He married his cousin, then another cousin, then someone who was basically a niece, then someone who was way too young because apparently the royal family tree wasn't the only thing lacking boundaries. Philip's 4 wives were Maria of Portugal, cousin, Mary I of England, cousin, Elizabeth of Valois, not too related, congratulations, Philip, you tried, Anna of Austria, niece. Marrying your niece is the historical equivalent of saying, I don't care what the geneticists say, I'm committed to the bit.
Philip's commitment to dynastic purity was so intense that he basically treated DNA like a limited edition collectible. His last wife, Anna of Austria, was particularly risky because the Austrian and Spanish Habsburgs were already aggressively related. When they had their son, Philip III, the court acted like everything was fine, even though the baby had that classic Habsburg look: long jaw, heavy eyelids, and the general energy of someone who really needed a nap. Philip himself was extremely religious, extremely controlling, and extremely convinced that marrying within the family was the only way to keep Spain stable. Spoiler, it wasn't. He spent much of his reign dealing with rebellions, bankruptcies, and the entire Spanish Empire slowly overheating like a laptop running too many programs. Meanwhile, the royal family tree was still folding in on itself like origami. But tonight, we're not stressing about the fall of empires. We're just floating gently through the oddities of royal romance choices. Gentle closing of part 1. As we drift to the end of this first part, let's take a slow breath and
Appreciate what we've covered. We met Charles II, the final Habsburg experiment. We fluted through Joanna's tragic emotional maze. We watched Philip II treat marriage like a genetic speed run. And this is only the beginning.